some housekeeping, as I had mentioned before. We'll keep the lines muted to be able to avoid background noise. We'll also, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand or you can present on the chat feature. Our presenters would like for you to please ask questions, and we'll have questions of you as well. So we hope that this is interactive and also very entertaining. So I'm going to pass the mic now to our guest presenter, Julia Lechuga.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Let me begin by just reading the title of the presentation, although Eric did a great job already. The Immigration Law Concern Scale, determining the influence of immigration laws on the HIV prevention behaviors of Hispanic immigrants to the U.S. And so Carol should join us momentarily, and in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and begin the webinar. So please advance. Okay. Immigration laws and policies are dynamic. This is something that, when we started with this project, we didn't know exactly the state of immigration laws. And something that we realized after speaking with many experts, including lawyers, that, they are very dynamic and differ considerably between and sometimes within states. So something that we want to make clear also is the information that we will present here cannot substitute for the advice of an attorney. And if you have specific questions and concerns, we would certainly encourage you to follow up, seeking formal advice. Please advance. And as Eric mentioned, we really want this to be a conversation. We consider ourselves academics. We're not in the front lines as you are. And we started this project from an academic perspective, but it really has been a process where we have been learning tremendously. And we hope that we can start a conversation so that we can know how best to proceed in the future. So we're hoping that this will be an interactive webinar. Please advance. So a brief overview. We're going to talk about what we did, essentially what the research project consisted of, what were some of the guiding questions. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the methodology behind it, and then we're going to discuss results. And at the end, we hope also to, to ask questions of you so that we can put the findings in better perspective and in context. Please advance. So let me begin by saying that Dr. Carol Galletly had an NIH grant that was funded through NIDA. And then she was looking at the influence of disclosure, HIV disclosure laws across states. And then the idea came through that, a particularly vulnerable, underserved population, recent Latino immigrants, might be also heavily influenced by these laws, and there are additional concerns that complicate matters. So she sought a supplement to develop a survey scale to determine whether, and if so, how actual and perceived immigration laws influence the HIV prevention-related behaviors of Latino immigrants. And something that I would like to emphasize here is that we have actual laws, but as I mentioned, these are very dynamic and changing all the time, so it's really hard to be well informed at one particular point in time about the specific immigration laws across the states. But what we thought was actually something of interest was what Latino immigrants were actually perceiving about the laws. And given that, the laws are very, again, dynamic, this perception could be very much, could influence very much their behaviors, and the perceptions might not correspond to the actual laws. So this is something that we wanted to check as well with the project. Please advance. So let me tell you that Dr. Galletly began this process by consulting a lot of legal materials. So she's an attorney, and she started by consulting legal documents about, how would concerns about immigration influence immigrants' health-seeking behaviors. So during this, process of document review, she ended up with 6 domains where she thought, perceptions about these domains are likely to really influence immigrants' health-seeking behaviors. And so she thought, for example, the first domain, confidentiality of medical information, she thought, and after reviewing the documents, that immigrants who might be in the process of adjusting their immigration status, who might be undocumented, might perceive, that their medical information might not be confidential. And so this is an important domain that might, heavily influence whether or not you decide to seek health services. Number 2, she came up also with this domain that unwanted attention from the government might be a particular area of concern. So whenever an immigrant decides, if to seek health services, the perception that maybe this behavior might lead to receiving unwanted attention from the government or governmental authorities, immigration authorities in particular, this again might negatively impact whether immigrants, decide to seek health services. Number 3, public charge concerns. This is a very a legal domain, much more than the others, because here it would be the perception that if you seek services and this is somehow documented, this is somehow not confidential, then this could potentially impact an immigrant's probability of adjusting their immigration status, or even being able to sponsor a family member who wants to immigrate into the U.S. So basically here is, if I use services, this might be on my record, and whenever I apply for an adjustment of status, then definitely this is going to weigh heavily against my possibility of, seeking legal residence in the U.S. Number 4, this domain concerns whether immigration authorities perceive HIV infection as a disfavored disease. So immigration and custom enforcement officials, IC, this is actually immigrants' belief as to how IC officials actually perceive HIV infection, and whether, if there's the remote possibility that you could be infected with HIV, you could be deported, or you could be denied legal residence in the U.S. Number 5, this domain concerns perceptions that if, during your stay in the U.S., you have mental illness or manifestations of mental illness, or whether you have a problem with addiction, your decision as an immigrant to seek services to alleviate some of these conditions, how that might negatively impact, your possibility, once again, of adjusting your status or of a family member. And then the last one, just concerns about healthcare access in general, and how, once again, there might be immigration-related concerns specifically regarding this domain. So I took a little bit more time on this slide, but I just wanted to touch, give specific definition as to the domains, because we're going to touch upon these later. And so just another thing that I want to clarify, aside from the document review, Dr. Galletly also convened a community advisory board consisting of, once again, lawyers, but also individuals who are advocating for immigrants in the health services area. And so she engaged in lengthy discussions talking about these domains, and so this is how we came up with the 6, not only the document review, but also receiving feedback from organizations such as such as you. So thank you very much for your help with this. Please advance. So, and I went ahead of myself, but so how we did it, again, asked lots of people, lots of questions about the legal concerns of Latino immigrants in the U.S., and basically we listened. You know, the 6 domains, once again, were not only document review, but also a lot of discussions, and so thank you again for that. Well, let me now talk a little bit more about our methods and participants. So first of all, the survey, once we ended up with the domains, then we went ahead and developed questionnaire items, basically, you know, trying to tap on the domain. So we developed a scale, a survey, and then the survey was administered to a sample of 300 sexually active, HIV-negative Latino immigrants in the southeastern United States. And so the survey was administered via computer to facilitate easiness of answering, and all of the materials were translated into Spanish. We followed a systematic process to get to questions that were easily to read and understand, and where, you know, we used language that would be pretty much understood by a heterogeneous sample of Latino immigrants in the U.S., and by this I mean immigrants who you know, came from various parts in Latin America, so Central Mexico, Central America, and South America. So now let me transition and talk a little bit about the actual demographics of our participants. So the average age of our participants was 34.08. The range was 18 to 74 years. We had a vast majority females, and 55% of our participants reported undocumented immigration status. Please advance. Thank you. And so here, I would like to show just that regarding country of birth, we had participants from many countries in Central and South America, but the vast majority, and this reflects actually the proportion of immigrants in the U.S., it pretty much reflects that the majority of immigrants come from Mexico, and that is no surprise given that we are neighbors. So 77% of our participants came from Mexico, and regarding preferred language, we assess their preferred language as a measure, you know, as an imperfect measure, but nonetheless we went ahead and assessed preferred language, and we thought this would be an index of acculturation into mainstream U.S. culture. And again, the majority prefer to speak Spanish always or most of the time, 65%. Please advance. Regarding marital status, remember we had 77% females, and regarding marital status, 42% approximately reported to be in a stable relationship but not married, and then approximately, you know, a little bit over 1/3 say that they were married, and then the rest reported to be single. Regarding education level, we see that the vast majority reported to have less than high school or high school education only. It was very interesting to see that, you know, when we looked at the specific items that were developed, just looking at frequencies, it was interesting to see that we had a good proportion sometimes of participants who didn't answer correctly some of the statements that reflected knowledge about immigration laws, and this is not surprising, again, just because, you know, just the fluctuation of immigration laws across states is just so hard to keep up with. But for example, to give you an example of some inaccurate beliefs that we found, the statement that we presented to participants, such as immigrants who have HIV can qualify for a green card or permanent residency status, we saw that 45% said that this was true, but look, it's very concerning that 55% said that this is false. In the U.S., doctors will inform immigration officials if an immigrant has HIV. This item is tapping onto the domain of confidentiality of medical information. We were happy to see that 78%, said that this is false, but we had a 22% that, identified this as true. And the next one would be immigrants will have less chance of becoming permanent residents if they seek treatment for alcohol problems. Here we were trying to tap on the domain of concerns of moral charge if you're trying to adjust your immigration status. 86% disagreed, but still we had 24% who agreed. And the next ones, right, so here, I would like to make the transition to talk about how once we analyze the results of our scale, once we used what is called in the field factor analysis to see which of these items that we developed to tap into the 6 domains really held well and were able to predict additional behaviors, we found that 3 domains actually were the ones that we had the best evidence that they were predicting and they were holding well together. And these were the domain of confidentiality of medical information and public charge concerns and concerns about HIV infection as a disfavored disease within the Immigration and Custom Enforcement officials. Once again, the items that we developed to tap on these different domains, only for 3 areas we found good evidence, good research evidence that the items were working well. Participants were consistent in responding to these items. We had a small percentage of error, and we were able to then aggregate the responses for the different items within each domain, and we were able to predict healthcare seeking behaviors. Please advance. And so let me again share with you or share examples of specific items that we presented to participants and asked them for their response. And all of the responses were assessed with binary response categories, so basically, yes or no. And so for confidentiality of medical information, this is an example of an item. Doctors cannot share immigrants' HIV test results with immigration officials. So again, we were here trying to see, whether participants would respond yes or no to this. And to the extent that they responded yes to items such as these, that meant that they, had scored higher on confidentiality of medical information, meaning that they believed that their medical information was confidential. The second domain, concerns related to public charge designation. Here we see an example. Seeking publicly funded health care can make one ineligible for permanent resident status. And again, here we had a similar items such as these. And to the extent that participants answered yes to items such as these, the greater the score, the more concerns they had about, seeking health care services and the impact that this would have on their ability to adjust their immigration status or that of the immigration status of a family member. The domain number 3, HIV as a disfavored disease. This is an example of an item. Immigrants can be removed, deported from the U.S. solely because they have HIV. Once again, we had several items such as these trying to tap at this area. And so participants who answered yes to items such as these, they perceived that Immigration and Custom Enforcement officials perceived HIV as a disfavored disease, and this could have very much a negative impact on legalization of status. And so now the next 3 slides, I'm going to talk about, actually how the responses to the different items within each of the domains were able to predict important behaviors, specifically, HIV-related behaviors. So confidentiality of medical information, we saw that participants who believe that their information was going to be confidential, the less concerns they had about being harassed by immigration authorities is if diagnosed as HIV positive. So we found a significant association between responses to confidentiality of medical information and less concerns about being harassed by authorities. In addition, concerns about being harassed by authorities was negatively related. That means that it was, the more concerns you had about being diagnosed as HIV positive, this affected whether you were willing to test for HIV. And so the more concerns, the more willing you are to test for HIV. We found that association. So confidentiality of medical information, responses, once again, to items tapping on this domain, we saw that it was significantly associated with the more you believe your information was confidential, the less perceived ramifications on immigration status if one is diagnosed as HIV positive. So in other words, the more you believe your information is confidential, the less you tended to believe that if you are diagnosed as HIV positive, this is going to have a negative impact on your immigration status. And perceived ramifications on immigration status, if one is diagnosed as HIV positive, once again, was associated with a reduced likelihood of testing for HIV. Go ahead and continue, please. The next one, remember, was this domain of concern with public charge designation. And here, once again, was the idea that if you seek healthcare services, somehow this could end up affecting the possibility of legalizing your immigration status or that of a family member. So participants who believe that, who answered questions that tapped on this domain and actually believe that seeking healthcare services could affect the possibility of legalizing your status, the greater they believe this, the more they perceive that, if they were diagnosed as HIV positive, they, this was going to negatively affect their immigration status. And I want to point out that we had, for the prior domain, we had smaller correlations or indices of association. But for this one, it was so interesting to see that we are getting correlations in the size of 0.43, which is absolutely magnificent when you are in the social sciences. It means that these variables will be able to predict other important behaviors. So perceived ramification on immigration status, if one is diagnosed as HIV positive, was also associated with ever testing for HIV. The more you perceive that seeking healthcare services was going to affect your potential for legalizing your immigration status, the less likely you are to test for HIV. And then concerns with public charge designation, once again, the greater you believe that, this could, seeking healthcare services could affect your immigration status, the more concerns you had about accessing healthcare services. And these were specifically, we assessed specific immigration-related concerns. And so, for example, I'll give you an example of an item that assessed immigration-related concerns. These were like, if I were diagnosed with HIV, authorities could monitor my sex life. This is an example of that particular construct. And once again, we see a correlation of 0.50, which is fairly high. And then, the more immigration-related concerns you had about accessing health care, this was associated with a less likelihood of testing for HIV. The last domain was HIV as a disfavored disease. And here we see that if participants believed that immigration and custom enforcement officials viewed HIV disfavorably, then if participants had this belief, this was positively associated with concerns about being harassed by immigration authorities if diagnosed as HIV positive. And here we see again a medium-sized correlation. And concerns of being harassed by authorities if diagnosed as HIV positive, the more you had these concerns, the less likely you were to test for HIV. And the more you believe that IC officials view HIV as a disfavored disease, the more perceived ramifications on immigration status if diagnosed as HIV positive. Participants, again, had these concerns as well, and we see a fairly high correlation here as well. Perceived ramifications on immigration status if one is diagnosed as HIV positive. This was associated with the less likelihood of participant testing for HIV. So as a whole, these three domains, again, we were so happy to see that they actually predicted HIV-related health-seeking behaviors in our sample. Please continue. And so now I am going to turn the webinar presentation to Dr. Carol Galletly, and she has much insight about some of these questions.
Thank you, Julia.
You're welcome.
I'm Dr. Carol Galletly, and when people signed up or registered for this webinar, they included some very interesting questions that I was going to address right now. So the first one is, do immigration laws differ by state? And that's a great question because, yes, they differ by state, but not only that, they differ by county, sometimes by city. And that's one of the issues that people talk about with our immigration laws today. In the United States, we have federal laws, then of course state laws, and then local municipalities have their own regulations. And the immigration law today has sort of fragmented, or what they call as a quilt, it's like a patchwork of varying laws. So it's very, very, very difficult to be able to know what's going on in a variety of states unless really you're full-time looking at it. Most people, including attorneys, focus on the law of their state and maybe the one next to them. So the next question is, do HIV-positive persons still have to disclose before entering the U.S.? And as you've heard from Julia, the answer is no. What's concerning is this has been since 2010, and still people aren't clear on this, don't know that you do not have to disclose status. The next question is, what effect does immigration law have on treatment-seeking behaviors of non-documented citizens? And this is actually fascinating because we anticipated that non-documented citizens or unregistered citizens would actually be more concerned about seeking treatment than individuals who were documented or individuals who were officially registered in the U.S. And what we found is actually there really aren't significant differences in concerns between those who are registered and those who are unregistered citizens, which we found very surprising. And what this means for us is that any research that we do on concerns about immigration laws needs to include people who are people who are documented or registered, as well as people who are undocumented. Often we just focus on people who are undocumented. We actually need to look at both groups. The next question is, how do immigration laws relate to health in the South, in the southern U.S.? And the next one after that is, what does our community need? These questions are actually questions we have for you. I can give you a little bit of information about number 4, which is, how do immigration laws relate to health in the South? And what I can tell you is, certainly in Arizona, there was legislation that was very, very restrictive for people who are immigrants and people who are undocumented. So what happened, though, is people focus on Arizona. And what they're not thinking about is there were lots of copycat laws or lots of laws created to address these issues in the South. So the South is actually a hotbed right now, probably even more so than what we're seeing of anti-immigration policy, probably even more than we're seeing, for example, in Arizona. So the last question is, what does our community need? And clearly, our community needs education. Clearly. People need to understand their rights. We also need, I think, to educate policymakers and to mobilize and try to make sure that our voices are heard in these discussions on immigration law. But actually, it's probably most important for us to hear what people in the field perceive they need, because that's how we direct our research to answer questions. So somebody just put up, oh, okay, another question is that that enforcement of these laws, not just laws, is very, very important. For example, in many states, there was a law that allowed police officers and other peace officers to actually implement or enforce immigration laws insofar as they could check the immigration status of people that they pulled over, for example. They contacted lawfully. And what this led to, of course, in people's concerns was racial profiling. What we found is even though areas the police had been trained to do background checks with immigration, many of them chose not to. So although we had a law that was reprehensible, that wasn't good at all, what we found is many officers on the ground chose not to enforce it. One of the problems with the Arizona law was that the law actually made it compulsory for officers to check the immigration status. So they would, at least in theory, have to enforce it. And, of course, that law, the majority of it has been overturned, and the rest is still in court. So those are your questions. Let's see. There's one more. Okay, there's actually another question. This data that we're talking about is from North Carolina. We did collect data in Tennessee as well, but the data that we collected in Tennessee was actually on people who were HIV positive. So next slide, please. Now we have questions for you, the individuals that are actually observing this webinar. And what we would like is some feedback and some ideas, information. Again, we can't conduct the research if individuals don't tell us what we need or what we're not seeing or what you've experienced or you perceive. So it's actually the listeners here that are the most important people for us. I don't think much of our research at all would happen without people giving us ideas or information or telling us things that were unjust that we could look at. So we would like what you to do is please raise your hand or use the text feature to respond. I have really no idea how you do that, but that's the directions. So, raise hand is at the top of your screen on the bar on the left, and then I think chat with presenter is the text feature. That would be on the left at the end. So the first question we have for you is, what legal difficulties do U.S. Hispanic immigrants face? What are you hearing out there about legal difficulties that Hispanic immigrants face? And this could be either those who are documented or registered or those who are undocumented or unregistered. So again, the question is, what legal difficulties do U.S. Hispanic immigrants face? Okay, so the question is, we have one response. Somebody said, I think this is very interesting, as this was mostly a sample of women. And in fact, our sample was 77% female, as Julia told you. Then the question is, did the analyses explore not just HIV services, but general services, including family planning and fears of having children taken away? That is such a great point. We actually focused this study on HIV-related behaviors. We wanted to start there. But now that we've seen these results, we certainly think that maybe we should branch out to see the impact of immigration laws on other health behaviors or social behaviors. So this question really gives us a heads up about other areas we might want to examine where immigration law may impact people's health behaviors. One of the questions I would have is, whenever we do this, we try to think it through and see where people might be afraid. So one of the questions would be, how might immigration laws impact somebody's willingness, a woman's willingness, to use family planning services? Or how might immigration law influence people's fears of having children taken away? Those are really good questions, and those are questions that we, of course, want to hear from you. So how would immigration law impact family planning services or fears of having children taken away? Okay, we'll get back to that. Let's go on with our next question for you to see if this jiggles your memory and helps you get ideas of feedback for us on things we should be looking at. So the second question is, how do these concerns influence what immigrants do or don't do? An example that we had found is the willingness or unwillingness of Hispanic immigrants, especially those who aren't registered, to call the police when either they've had a crime committed upon them or a loved one has. This is very, very troubling to think that people are afraid to call the police when they need the police because of their not wanting to have their immigration status revealed. So we're kind of wondering, how would concerns about immigration influence what immigrants do or don't do? We were thinking that there probably are some around working and occupational environment. Then let's see. We also have heard there's a scale actually that talks about people who are immigrants even being afraid or concerned about just walking on the streets. These are the things we need to know. Okay, one of the things we talk about with legal difficulties, and a participant has sent us a text, is that education, enforcement, awareness, perceptions of retaliation, which are often valid, that's how the concerns influence what immigrants do or don't do. And that's so true, especially education, enforcement, awareness, and those are all things that we can address. Perceptions of retaliation, which people perceive are often valid, this is something that Julia and I could easily, not easily, but we could study this to make sure that individuals who are making law or enforcing law, we could easily get the data to show experiences of retaliation if we find out how often this happens. A question for those who are watching is, how often do you guys have a sense that immigrants in your area are harassed or retaliated against by the police. Our response says it's the often valid perception of retaliation. And actually, I haven't heard a lot about that, and certainly haven't read much about it. Very interesting for us.
And sorry to interrupt, but I think this is an excellent forum and opportunity for co-learning. We really were excited about doing this webinar to also hear about your experiences, your particular populations, even helping us think how these results might or might not apply to your particular population. So we would really appreciate it if you could engage and let us know.
Well said, Julia. Okay, so the next question, which Julia mentioned, is how might immigration law concerns about impact on somebody's immigration status influence Hispanic immigrants' willingness to seek health care, have a diagnostic test, or actually be honest with a healthcare provider? And these are the issues that are so important. Let's see. So the questions about retaliation, we've had one response was there are different ways to operationalize or actually conceptualize what retaliation looks like, and perhaps only a few cases that are documented. That should be enough. In science, what we're able to do also, besides document cases, is we can extend over a large area and find out more about cases and compare places, for example, where there isn't retaliation with places where we do identify retaliation, and see what's different and what we can change so that the places where negative is happening, we can make it positive. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Oops, sorry, excuse me. Now this one is so important. We would really like, as Julia said, this to be a co-learning experience. And these are the questions right now that we're asking ourselves over and over again. And it is number 4, what physical and mental health conditions would an immigrant want to hide from immigration officials? And we gave examples of, are there particular illnesses like HIV? Somebody mentioned that TB in some Latino countries is stigmatized. Tuberculosis is stigmatized. And individuals may think, because it's so stigmatized, they don't want immigration officials to know they have it. Are there kinds of injuries or situations where people are injured where they would want to hide that from immigration officials? That was one of the key things we were thinking about, was what injuries would people want to hide? And then there's chronic conditions. Are there chronic conditions people don't want to be diagnosed with or disclose? And then also behavioral issues. We thought a lot about that, maybe mental health issues. So let's see. We'll pause for a couple seconds to see what your ideas are on illnesses or conditions that people would want to hide from immigration officials. One question we had was actually occupational injuries. Are there situations where either because somebody's undocumented or because they're afraid of losing their job somehow, that they might not actually get treatment for or disclose that they have an occupational injury. Okay. Then somebody, oh, this is really important. Workers' compensation cases, this I'm reading somebody's comment, are often not reported because of the fear of authority. And companies take advantage of this situation. Those are the things that that's very helpful for us to know. Very helpful. So are there any other areas where an immigrant might want to hide information from immigration officials? And remember, often they'll do this by hiding information from their physicians or doctors, their medical care providers. So they might have, for instance, any sort of illness and not be willing to tell a doctor, depending on, as Julia was talking about, their concerns about confidentiality. So physical and mental health conditions that immigrants would want to hide. Okay, as people write those responses, the last question we had are, what health-related experience? Oh, and here we say workplace injury, injury due to violence, potential infection that's contagious, such as meningitis or sexually transmitted infection, would an immigrant want to hide from immigration officials? For example, we really do think about what if there were some sort of an epidemic in the U.S. with a contagious illness? Would people who are immigrants want to hide that? Would they have concerns that if they were identified as having or diagnosed as having an illness, that they might not want to disclose for fear that of what would happen with their immigration status? Okay. One of the responses was H-2A workers, seasonal migrant workers, don't want to share their physical problems because they're scared that they won't get a visa to come to work in the U.S. in the agricultural industry. That's really helpful for us to know. Migrant workers, we haven't done work yet with specifically migrant workers, but we're having the sense that that may be a population or should be a population we should study more. An interesting comment was a respondent was saying, again, I am thinking of specific women's issues, which is really helpful for us.
Very helpful.
Also, LGBT immigrants and individuals experiencing intimate partner violence. One of the things that Julia and I had thought about was, as many people may know, an individual who is here based on someone else's immigration status. So, for instance, a husband is here, or a man, heterosexual man, is here and brings his spouse to the U.S. So, if his spouse is a woman, her residence in the U.S. is based on his status. Well, what happens is, if she is being beaten, or especially seriously beaten, threatened, that sort of thing, it used to be that she would have to make a choice between leaving the United States or staying in this an injurious relationship. Now, women or men who are in relationships where there is intimate partner violence and where their residence in the U.S. is based on the perpetrator, the aggressor's status, they can actually get special permission to stay in the U.S. without being linked to their spouse. The interesting issue for us is that's to apply for some sort of a status to be able to leave a spouse and stay in the U.S. still takes some courage, not only courage, but some time and some work. Our question is, what if an individual, typically would be a female, is in a marriage or relationship where they don't want to leave? It hasn't risen to that severity yet, but there is intimate partner violence. Would an immigrant, female typically, could be a man, be willing to seek services that are sort of in between the huge, not the huge, but starting out a legal process to be able to stay in the U.S.? That's a big process, and not doing anything. Is there a middle ground? For instance, would a Latina female, be willing to go to a women's shelter? Okay. Let's see. Then we have another one. Oh, this is important. Another response says, in response to question 2, I have found that some parents that we have in our clinic were registered under false name and social security number. They're scared to register under their true name. And we have heard that, and actually Eric and Judy have also sensitized that to us, or sensitized us to that. One of my questions about that was, do individuals use different names or social security numbers in the same place over time? So, for instance, would they use a different name today and then use one again that was different next year? If that were to happen, that would really negatively impact continuity of care. Still being scared to register under their true name is awful. And to be put at stake for legal action because you used a false social security number in order to get health care is absolutely what we don't want to see. Nobody should risk any sort of legal action against them in order to get health care.
Something also that I wanted to raise is that, something that we have not explored is the potential impact that these concerns might have on the Affordable Care Act. So if you are afraid, all of this is going to have a potential impact, and this is a work that we are barely starting. And that's why we wanted so much to connect with you in order to see what is the way forward.
That's a terrific point, Julia. We really haven't. Although people who are unregistered or undocumented cannot use the benefits of the Affordable Care Act, there are all sorts of other things, both for immigrants, registered and unregistered immigrants, that the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare does pertain to.
Especially registered, right? And so if registered immigrants are still having these concerns, it might impact.
And we got another response from the individual that was talking about people using false names and social security numbers. This is a really interesting issue. So somebody has gone to a clinic under a false name. Now they want to change their name to their true name. And I could see this happening too. There are prohibitions against using publicly funded health care for a time after one achieves legal permanent resident status. So I could see over time when the individual is okay to use public health services where they might want to change to their true name, but be required to go through a legal process to do that. This is a great comment. In regards to the question of would, for instance, a Latina immigrant be willing to go to a shelter? Somebody's saying, I work with a local intimate partner violence prevention rape response organization in Alabama. Oh, that's fabulous. Thank you so much for doing that important work. And generally, they see very few Latinas because of lack of trust in workers. Few Spanish-speaking nurses or advocates, and fear of deportation. The individual says, however, there is a champion in a partner Latino-Latina serving organization, somebody that's trusted, and they are sometimes connected. And that may be the most important thing we can offer, is creating or helping to create networks of trusted people to help Latina immigrants or Latino immigrants to actually use the services they need. Somebody's comment about changing name is no, most people are using their real names because clinics are now taking consulate identification or passports as identification. It's interesting. It's really important for us to hear what people are really doing, because oftentimes the law may say one thing, but people are doing something very different. Okay. I think we're out of time at this point, or running low on time. Next slide, please. So, Julia would like to close us.
Yes, so muchísimas gracias por ayudarnos a que este estudio se lograra. We had wonderful people who collaborated with us, wonderful organizations who provided insight. Thank you very much for your help with this important study, and something that I really want to emphasize. Sometimes we are on a daily basis seeing all of these issues and problems and how they negatively impact the immigrant Latino population. But another thing is to actually document it and put it out there. We are very hopeful that we might be able to exert some influence with policymakers as to how immigration reform is so necessary. And so thank you so much, and I hope that we can be in contact.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carol Galletly and Dr. Julia Lechuga, for joining us today on this. This is, I think we're really privileged to be able to have this information and this data, and it's really important for us to continue to have this evidence-based research in the South to be able to help us further with our work. So, on behalf of Latinos in the Deep South, I thank you guys very much for sharing this and presenting. And thank you all for sharing, for spending time with us today. Please remember to follow us on Twitter and give us a like on Facebook. And please contact us and let us know what other types of subjects you would like to hear for other webinars from Latinos in the Deep South. Thank you, everybody. Have a good afternoon.